This time we are going to look at two types of positions. The first one being the position with the rook in the corner and the pawn just one square away, and with additional pawn on the H, G, and F files. And the other type of position will be the position with the king in the corner and then the pawn in the one square away, and the other king is allowing the king to escape, and seeing how the position can be a little bit improved by the attacking side, but at the same time how the defending side can make a very easy and simple plans to remember to defend against this type of simple threats. Let's get into it. What happens if we add up one pawn for the attacking side when the rook is in the corner and the pawn is just one square away? Take notice we are talking about the pawn at the edge of the board. Now let's add the pawn at the other side of the board at the H file. After the pawn moves forward h6, the king cannot go back and forth over the squares g7, h7 as the pawn is attacking the square g7. And now what happens if the rook captures the pawn? After that, we are just making the rook a little bit forward. Of course, this one with the check after the capture, the pawn promotion to queen works as well. After the rook gets behind, we are just promoting the pawn, and of course the queen is protected, therefore we are winning easily. And now what happens if the king would capture the pawn? Of course, you know this idea from the previous example. After the rook throwing the check, the rook cannot capture the pawn as the king is in check. After the king attacks the rook, of course the queen attacks the rook attacks the queen, and of course white is winning easily. Therefore, at this moment after the pawn moves forward, neither the rook, neither the king can capture the pawn. The king cannot go back and forth over the g7 square and h7 as the pawn is attacking this square, therefore the rook must go onto this file to make the contact with the promoting square, of course without dropping the rook into one of the squares the king can capture. Take notice at such setup the rook has always have two squares to go into the line without being captured, therefore it's safe. And therefore let's have a look. And now at this moment the rook can go back and forth over these two squares as long as it's not going to be captured by the king. And of course, if the king touches the pawn, as we just explained at the previous episode, we are just harassing the king. After the king is not touching the pawn anymore, we are just putting the rook behind the pawn. And of course, again, if the king touches the pawn, we are harassing. If not, we are going back and forth over the rook in the line that is behind the pawn. And of course, the game ends in a draw. What happens if we add the pawn on the G file? Does it make any difference? Let's check it out. Of course, after the G6 check, again, the same ideas applies. If we just start with the rook capture, of course, the same idea as previous example. After the rook step back, the pawn promotes, rook capture, and now we are winning. Of course, at this moment, after rook captures, we can go rook check, and if the king captures, after the pawn promotion queen versus rook, it's going to be win as well, therefore this one seems a little bit easier, at least from my experience. And now what happens if the king captures the pawn? Of course, the same idea as previously, the rook gets with check, the king cannot capture, and after the king attacks the rook, the pawn and the queen are mutually protecting each other, and after the capture, we are just simply winning. And that's why the pawn cannot be captured after the pawn is attacking the king, neither by the rook or the king. And now, after the king gets in front of the pawn, take notice this time the pawn will be cutting off the square h7 from the defense h7, g7, and the rook going into this line without dropping the rook to be captured by the king. And now, of course, if the king gets closer into the pawn, as long as the king is not touching the pawn, we can go back and forth with the rook. But at the moment when the king is touching the pawn, we must harass the king with the check. After the king is no longer protecting the pawn, we can just stay behind the pawn. If it touches, we are just harassing the king. Of course, if the king is trying to get closer into one of these squares, we are just staying in one of these that are safe ones, but always behind the pawn. And of course, the game ends in a draw. And now we just analyze the position with the other pawn on the H, G, and now the time with the pawn on the F file. How does it change the position? Let's check it out. After f6 check, again, there are two possible captures. if you capture with the rook, the same ideas as previously. Rook step back, and after that we are just winning. Of course, as I just mentioned, rook can throw the check to attack the king and then make the new promoted queen with check. It doesn't change the outcome. And now what happens if the king captures? As I explained in the previous stuff, the rook step back with check. The rook cannot capture the pawn as the king is attacked by the rook. After the king attacks the rook, the pawn is promoted, and now after that we are winning again. Therefore, at the pawn going into f6, neither the rook nor the king can capture the pawn. And now what are the other ways? Take notice, the king cannot step back into the back rank. We just analyzed capturing the pawn, and now we have just 4 moves to go by the king. Of course, if the king gets h6, f7, f8 is the promoting. And now if the king gets into the g6, we are just pushing the pawn forward, forcing the king to capture the pawn, otherwise it's the promotion. After the king capture, we have the classical idea with the trick on the 7th rank with the x-ray or skewer. After that we are winning the rook. Therefore this doesn't work either. And now we just analyze all of the ideas except the king getting into the f7 or the king getting into the h7. Let's check it out. After king h7, the pawn moves forward, threatening again the promotion, and after the king gets closer, the pawn is just protected by the rook being promoted into the queen. And the last one, what happens if the king gets into the f7? Now it seems like that everything's pretty much nice, but take notice that there is one important issue. Why is that? Because now we are making the same idea as if the pawn would not be here, because the king is not sitting in one of these two squares with the g7, h7 maneuver, and then the rook can go back and forth to have the control over the promoting square. And of course, the threat is to promote the pawn, therefore the rook must capture, and after the capture, we have this trick with the x-ray on the 7th and winning the game. Therefore, the conclusion is the following. If we have the typical setup, the rook in the corner, the pawn in front of the rook, then the rook behind the pawns controlling the promoting square, the king can go back and forth onto the squares g7, h7. The draw is with the pawns, the other pawn with the h and g file, but not with the pawn on the f, e, d, c, or b file. That's why it must be remembered that only these two pawns on the h and g files gives the opportunity for black to make a draw, but otherwise if the pawn is on f file up to the b file, the other one of course, then the white wins easily. And now let's check it out. What happens if the king instead of the rook is in the corner? There are very easy ideas to start with. And now let's check it out what happens at such position. First of all, if the rooks are gone at this moment, the position would be simply drawn, no matter who is on the move. If white to move, white cannot make any legal moves, therefore it's a stalemate. If black to move, of course without the rooks, the king would be going back and forth over these two squares, not allowing the king to escape from the prison, and therefore it's a stalemate and a draw as well. But what happens if you have the rooks? Therefore, at this moment it's pretty easy as well. After the rook gets here, take notice, the rook can only harass the king, attacking it from the squares b8, b7. But does it help somehow? Not quite. The king will be going back and forth, and now if the rook is trying to help the king to escape, it's not possible as long as the king will be having these squares covered. And that's why we are going back and forth over the same file as the king. And now if the rook throws the check, we are going back and forth over these two squares c8, c7. Of course, after the rook step back, again, at this moment we cannot get the king into c8 as the rook is controlling this square, therefore we are going with the rook onto one of the squares on the c file. And now again, if the rook throws the check, c8, c7. c8 is possible, therefore we are going here. And now at this moment, c7 is not possible, therefore we are going with the rook. And now again, as you can see, at this moment we are going back and forth, white cannot strengthen the position. Take notice, the only way white tries to push away the king would be to throw the check on the c file, but it's not possible because the rook is controlling this, and of course, if the king cannot get outside of the pawn cannot reach the promotion. Therefore, at this setup, the position is simply drawn. Now what happens if we have a little bit different setup? This time the rook is cutting off the king right here, but the rook is a little bit different place. At this moment, very important distinction. The rook is attacking the other rook. As black, we cannot capture the rook because the pawn would recapture, promoting to the queen and then protecting, therefore white would win. But at this moment, again, as long as the white king cannot escape, the position would be won. And now at this position, easy way to remember. Try to put the rook onto the square, onto the file the king is standing on, and get either king c8, c7 or rook c1, c2. Either way is good as long as we do not drop the piece. And now at this moment, the king cannot escape, as you can see. If you can play c8, c7, play it. Of course, at this moment, white tries to see what black is going to do. And now at this moment, if black is not allowed to play king c8, c7, we are playing rook c1, c2. And now again, after throwing the checks, take notice the rook is cutting off the square c8, therefore c8, c7 is not possible, therefore rook c1, c2, and just playing back and forth, white cannot improve the position. They can of course repeat, but they cannot improve. The game ends in a draw. Another one, this time a little bit different, because take notice now the rook is from the other side, but again, we just cut off the king onto the file that king tries to escape, and the king is cutting off the king from the squares, either c8, c7, therefore it's something like a double lock. Therefore, now the only way to throw the check is right here, because the other one doesn't make too much progress as we just analyzed before. Throwing the check on the c2 doesn't allow the black king to control these squares any longer. But what happens? Again, the rook is cutting off the king, therefore the king cannot escape itself. Therefore, the rook is trying to help the king, but as long as the rook is not getting into the square b8 or b7, counter-attacking the rook, the king cannot escape by itself. Therefore, we are going back and forth with our rook on the b file, not allowing the king to escape. Therefore, at this moment, we are not making any, let's say, improvement for the opponent. And now, at this moment, after the rook cut off, the king allows the king to get closer. We are going c8, c7. It doesn't matter which one, both are okay. I prefer a little bit more c7, but both are okay. And now again, even if the rook would be here, we are just putting the rook onto the same file as the king, and the game is drawn, as we just saw at the previous example. Another position, this time the rook is cutting off the king, but take notice we need to have the king that is having these squares covered as well. Therefore, the simplest way to draw is getting king c7. And now if we have the double lock, the king cannot escape, the game is drawn. No matter what white does, if black plays correctly, the game ends in a draw. The same ideas as previous examples. Now what happens is the king is pretty far away from one of the squares not to allow the king to escape. The simplest way is to go either right here onto d7, c8, either d6, c7, or similar stuff, because we can go d7, c7 as well. And now, after the king gets d7, again, if the king gets c8 or c7, this could be the automatic draw, because we already analyzed this position. Therefore, the rook is trying to get a little bit faster, counter-attacking the rook, because the king cannot get closer, because rook would be attacked. But now it is black that is just cutting off these squares, and after rook here, we are just going rook on the same file as the king, and the game ends in a draw, as we just saw in the previous positions. And one more position. This time, take notice the king is pretty far away, either from c8 or c7. Therefore, at this moment, we are going as close as possible, the closest route into the c7 or c8 square. And now, at this moment, the simplest way is to get into the square d6, then c7, because we are reaching the squares the king cannot escape. After the rook cuts off the square c7 to reach by the black king, we are just going with the king c6. Why? Because now the rook cannot get into b7, and now at this moment, after the rook tries to limit our king, we have the king and rook lock up this one. If we just reach it, the position is drawn. No matter what white does, white cannot improve the position. There will be the repetition after this one. If they try to guess the other way, we are just put the rook onto the c file, and either the king c8, c7, rook c1, c2, and as we just saw in the previous example, the attacking side cannot improve the position. And now one more important stuff at the end, because I would like to show something very interesting. At this moment, instead of playing rook c6, we can play rook b2. Of course, I do not recommend it, because if you just start to get into the exceptions, you can mess up in the next, let's say, positions, and there are hundreds of positions in rook endgames that can be very easily lost if you do not have some kind of patterns and simple plans in your database in your mind. Therefore, I'll just show it just as a little bit like curiosity. And now, at this moment, rook c7 seems like the king is going to escape, the pawn is moving forward, and now the pawn will be promoted, isn't it? I was a little bit shocked when I was preparing these positions, and when I just look at the table bases, it looks like it's a draw. But what is the idea, I may ask? Check it out. Rook e2 going right here. And now, if you go with the king, with the plan of promoting, look what a beautiful checkmate. The king is cutting off the c7 square, the rook is cutting off the squares on the back rank, and both the rooks and the pawn are cutting off the only square escape squares for the king. Therefore, a fantastic checkmate. And now, what else, you may ask, right? At this moment, if the rook is trying to not allow the king to get closer, for example, like that, we are just having this resource, king c7. And now, if we just have this rook away, and then the other rook would be making the double lock, you know it's already a draw. But of course, white will be trying to get a little bit harder for the defending side. Now we are going king b6. I can say, wait a second. After that, king gets into the square b8, the rook can block and the pawn can promote, isn't it? Not quite. After the rook step back into the last rank, because now we were threatening the checkmate into, yes, we are just attacking even if we are defending. After rook c8, we are going rook here, threatening to take the pawn with check. After the rook throws the check, we are going right here. And again, if the rook will bring it back and forth over these two squares, we are going c8, c7, or the rook a2, a1. And of course, after the rook tries to push back the king, we are just going right here. We just reached the position we already known that is drawn from the previous examples. The king is cutting off the escape square. The rook cannot be chasing away the king from the c file, and we are going c8, c7, rook c1, c2, of course, if the moves are legal and without dropping the piece. And the game ends in a draw. Okay, guys, these were the positions that I guess these were one of the easiest to show, to remember, and to explain. And step by step, we are going into a little bit more challenging ones. Therefore, I encourage you either to review the positions and play out against your friend, against the computer, or against some of your friends, because this way you are just cementing the knowledge. And the next positions and the next episodes will get a little bit more challenging positions and a little bit more analysis. But as always, I'll try to make it as much instructive as possible, at the same time providing a lot of explanations in an easy and understandable way. Let's have a look the next one in the next episode. Thank you very much and see you next time. Take care.